Michael Jennings pulled into the parking lot, carefully easing his car into an open space in front of the grocery store. It was a mild afternoon, the kind of day that almost made the world seem kinder, a day to relax, get errands done, and enjoy the small moments of calm that life allowed. Michael wasn't prepared for the sudden storm brewing in the next parking spot. As he turned off the engine and reached for his shopping list, an irate voice cut through the ambient noise of the parking lot. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Startled, he looked up to see a woman standing beside his car, hands on her hips, her face twisted in frustration. She looked to be in her late 40s, with short, permed hair and an expression that seemed to radiate judgment. Michael blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "You took my spot," she snapped, her voice sharp, every word laced with an accusatory tone. "I was waiting for it, and you just swooped in." Her tone was harsh, as if she'd been wronged in some grand way. Michael, still seated in his car, felt a pang of annoyance but kept his tone steady. "Ma'am, there are plenty of other spots here." "I didn't see you waiting," he replied calmly, gesturing toward the open spaces in the lot. But the woman, undeterred, took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "That's not the point. The point is that you think you can just take whatever you want, don't you? No respect for others." Michael was taken aback. This was just a parking spot, and there were at least 5 others open nearby. But it was clear she wasn't going to let this go. He took a slow breath, determined to keep the peace. "I didn't mean to offend you, ma'am," he said evenly. "I'll just go find another spot if it matters that much." He began to open his door, but she moved closer, blocking his exit. "You people," she spat, her tone dripping with disdain. "Always think the rules don't apply to you. Just because someone feels sorry for you doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want." Her words hung in the air, each one landing like a cold slap. It wasn't just the accusation, it was the unspoken venom beneath it. Michael felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He'd faced this kind of attitude before, but it never got easier. Still, he forced himself to stay calm, not giving her the reaction she seemed to be hoping for. "Look, I'm not trying to cause any trouble," he said, his voice remaining steady but firm. "It's a parking spot. I didn't see you, but I'm happy to move." The woman's expression shifted from anger to something darker, as if his calm demeanor was somehow a personal affront. "Don't you patronize me," she hissed. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I've seen people like you come and go, thinking they own the place. People like you." The words repeated in Michael's mind. He knew exactly what she meant, and it was all he could do to keep his composure. "I don't think I own anything here, ma'am," he replied slowly. "I just came to get groceries, just like you." But his attempt to de-escalate seemed to enrage her further. Her face flushed, and she took another step forward, her voice rising. "You have no idea what it's like to be in my shoes, do you? Working hard every day, dealing with entitled people who think they're owed something just for existing." Michael took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but a part of him was growing frustrated. This wasn't the first time he'd been judged like this, and he knew it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, he didn't want to give her any ammunition. "I don't know your story, ma'am," he said evenly. "But I'm just here to get groceries, like everyone else." "Like everyone else?" she sneered. "As if you belong here." There it was, her voice filled with barely masked disdain, and Michael felt a rush of anger, as much as he tried to hold it back. He couldn't understand why someone would react this way over something so trivial. But he knew he had to be the bigger person. "Look," he said, his voice now colder but still controlled, "I'll move the car if that's what you want. I didn't come here to argue." She didn't answer, only stared at him, her eyes simmering with a bitterness that didn't seem rooted in this moment but in something much older, something she'd been carrying for a long time. As he started to close his door, hoping to just move to another spot and end this encounter, she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. Entitled, arrogant, all the same. The word stung. Michael felt the heat rising in his chest, a familiar anger that he'd learned to bury deep, the anger that came from years of slights and whispers, of assumptions and prejudices. But he forced himself to stay calm, knowing he had nothing to gain from giving her the reaction she was pushing for. "I hope you have a good day, ma'am," he said, refusing to let her words provoke him any further. He pulled the door shut, determined to let this go. But as he turned the key in the ignition, her voice rang out again, louder this time. "Walking away, huh? Figures. Just can't take responsibility, can you?" Michael closed his eyes for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He wanted nothing more than to get his groceries and go home, to leave this hostility behind. But the bitterness in her voice, the accusations she hurled at him, they weighed heavily, refusing to let him go as easily as he wanted. He could feel her gaze on him, watching, waiting for a reaction. And even as he pulled out of the parking spot, Michael could sense that this wasn't over. Michael managed to find another spot a few rows down, parking with a sigh of relief as he prepared to shake off the tension of the encounter. But as he stepped out of his car and locked the door, he noticed the woman, Karen, as he'd mentally labeled her by now, was following him, her heels clicking against the pavement with a determined purpose. He glanced over his shoulder, hoping she'd let it go, but the look on her face made it clear she wasn't done. She approached, her expression a mix of anger and twisted satisfaction, as if she were finally getting her chance to vent whatever frustration she had been holding in. "You just think you can walk away from this, huh?" she scoffed, her voice echoing louder than before, drawing the attention of a few people nearby. "Like none of this matters." Typical. Michael stopped, feeling the eyes of bystanders turn in their direction. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to respond. He didn't want a scene, but it seemed Karen did. "People like you," she continued, her voice tinged with a venomous edge. "You come here, thinking you can do whatever you want, take up space, make a mess, and then leave everyone else to pick up the pieces." Michael took a steady breath, willing himself to stay calm. He turned to face her, hoping one final attempt at reason would end this. "Ma'am, I really don't know what you're trying to say here, but I'm just here to shop, like everyone else. There's no need to involve anyone else in this." "Oh, isn't that convenient?" she sneered. "The innocent act. I'm sure it's worked for you plenty of times before. But it's not fooling me." Her eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, lowering her voice but keeping the contempt thick. "I know what people like you are capable of." The accusation, thinly veiled as it was, cut deep. Michael had always known there were people who saw him as less worthy, less entitled, less human. But hearing it so bluntly, in public, was another level of disrespect, and it took all his self-control not to let his anger rise. This wasn't just about a parking spot, this was something uglier, something that had festered for longer than he'd been in that lot. "Look," he said, struggling to keep his tone even. "I don't want any trouble. I don't know you, and frankly, you don't know me either. Let's just go our separate ways." She let out a bitter laugh, loud enough to make a couple of people glance over with raised eyebrows. "Oh, I know plenty," she sneered. "People like you have no respect for where you are. You don't care about the rest of us, about our neighborhoods, our communities. You think everyone owes you something." Michael's patience was wearing thin. He could feel the tension in his body intensifying, the restraint he usually kept so tightly wound beginning to fray. He looked around, noticing how people were watching them now, some with mild curiosity, others with disinterest. And in that moment, he felt exposed, as if he were a spectacle in some drama he hadn't asked to be part of. "Ma'am," he said, trying once more to end the conversation. "I don't know what's bothering you, but this really isn't the time or place for this." He turned to leave, determined to escape this venomous interaction. But before he could take a step, Karen's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "Don't walk away from me," she snapped, her grip tightening as if to pull him back. Startled, Michael pulled his arm free, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Please don't touch me, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want any trouble." Her face twisted in outrage, her cheeks reddening as she let out a harsh laugh. "Oh, now I'm the bad guy? You're the one causing problems here, walking around like you own the place, making everyone else uncomfortable." Michael could feel his heart pounding, the frustration and anger he'd been holding back bubbling dangerously close to the surface. He wanted to scream, to tell her that he was just trying to live his life, just trying to be left alone. But he knew better than to give her the reaction she was provoking. As he took a step back, preparing to simply walk away, Karen's hand flew out in a flash, and before he could react, he felt the sharp sting of her slap across his face. The force of it shocked him, the slap echoing in the quiet of the parking lot. For a brief moment, there was a stunned silence, a beat of disbelief shared by both of them. Karen's eyes widened, as if she were just realizing what she'd done. But rather than apologizing, her face twisted into a smug, satisfied expression. She lifted her chin, staring him down as if daring him to respond. Michael's cheek burned where she'd struck him, the shock mixing with a simmering anger he could no longer hold back. He took a steadying breath, his hands clenched at his sides, feeling the weight of years of quiet tolerance. The idea of walking away crossed his mind, but he knew that allowing her to get away with this would mean allowing her, and others like her, to believe that this behavior was acceptable. So, without a word, he lifted his hand and slapped her back, a sharp, quick movement that landed with enough force to make her stumble back a step. Her face registered a mix of shock and outrage, her eyes wide with disbelief. You just hit me," she gasped, clutching her cheek as if he'd committed some grievous offense. Her voice rose, loud and shrill, quickly drawing the attention of more bystanders. "Help! This man assaulted me." Michael felt his pulse quicken as people around them began to murmur, their gazes shifting between him and Karen, who was now playing the victim, clutching her face and putting on a show for anyone willing to watch. "You hit me first," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. But Karen was already weaving a new story, her voice trembling with faux indignation as she addressed the onlookers. "I was just trying to get to my car, and he attacked me out of nowhere." She took a shaky breath, feigning tears. "Someone, please call the police. I don't feel safe." Michael felt a bitter frustration settle in his chest as he watched her performance, realizing that she was now twisting the narrative to suit her own needs. And as he glanced around, he could see the uncertainty in the faces of those watching, some of them beginning to question who was really in the wrong. But Michael knew the truth. And for once, he wasn't going to let her take control of the story. As Karen's cries filled the parking lot, Michael remained rooted, his mind racing. He had seen this kind of performance before, how easily certain people could shift the narrative, turning themselves from aggressor to victim with just a few well-timed words and crocodile tears. A small crowd had gathered, watching with uncertainty, and Michael felt the weight of their eyes, some sympathetic, others skeptical. "Ma'am," he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady even as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "You slapped me first. I only defended myself." But Karen wasn't listening. Her face twisted in exaggerated pain, and she continued shouting, her voice rising with every word. He hit me. This man hit me. I was just minding my own business, and he attacked me. She threw a quick, furtive glance at the onlookers, making sure she had their attention, feeding off the growing tension. Michael scanned the crowd, hoping to see a friendly face, someone who had witnessed what really happened. But most of them seemed hesitant, unsure of what they'd seen. He could feel the situation slipping away from him, Karen's cries filling the air, drawing more onlookers and twisting the reality of what had actually taken place. Taking a deep breath, he spoke louder, his voice steady. "You all saw her hit me first," he said, addressing the crowd. "I was just trying to walk away." But Karen had already crafted her narrative, and she knew how to work her audience. Her voice dropped to a tremble, her hand still pressed to her cheek, as if she were truly hurt. "I can't believe this," she murmured, casting a glance around. "I've never felt so threatened in my life." A couple of people in the crowd murmured, exchanging uncertain glances. Michael felt his patience wearing thin, the injustice of the situation settling heavy on his shoulders. He turned to leave, deciding that no matter what, he wouldn't give her any more ammunition. He headed towards the store, determined to ignore her theatrics. But as he walked, he could hear her shouting behind him, trying to draw him back, calling him names he wouldn't repeat in front of his family. Each word was another barb, intended to provoke him, to pull him back into her twisted game. But he refused to give her the satisfaction. Once inside the store, Michael tried to focus on his shopping, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He moved through the aisles, gathering what he needed, his mind racing with the memory of Karen's accusations. Part of him wished he'd recorded the interaction, just to have proof of her hostility, of her aggression. But he knew that even with evidence, people were quick to believe the narrative that fit their own biases. As he approached the checkout, he noticed something odd. A few people in the store were glancing at him, whispering to each other. It was subtle, but he could feel the ripple of attention following him, Karen's story already spreading, poisoning the air around him. He felt the familiar weight of prejudice, the silent, unspoken accusations that lingered just beneath the surface. Michael paid for his groceries, trying to keep his head held high, determined not to let her twisted version of events affect him. But as he stepped back out into the parking lot, he froze. His car, once pristine, was now marred by deep, jagged scratches running along the side, as if someone had taken a key or some other sharp object and dragged it across the paintwork with brutal force. He didn't need to wonder who had done it. He knew. Taking a steadying breath, Michael walked around the car, surveying the damage. It was deep enough that he'd need to get the entire side repainted, and he could only imagine the cost. His frustration swelled, mixing with a sense of helplessness. He'd done nothing to provoke this, nothing to deserve the treatment he was enduring, but here he was, dealing with the aftermath of someone else's rage, someone else's prejudice. As he stood there, Karen reappeared, her face twisted into a mocking smile, a satisfaction shining in her eyes that made his blood boil. "What's the matter?" she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Having a rough day?" Michael clenched his fists, fighting the urge to confront her, to make her understand the damage she'd done. But he knew that any reaction from him would only fuel her narrative, only give her more ammunition to twist the story even further. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, to be the bigger person. But as he turned to walk away, she muttered something under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear. "Animals like you don't belong here anyway." The words hit him like a punch, and he felt his composure slipping. He turned, his voice low and steady but laced with barely contained anger. "You've done enough damage. Leave me alone." Karen's smile only grew, a look of twisted satisfaction in her eyes as she stepped closer. "Oh, did I hurt your feelings?" she taunted, her voice mocking, as if this were all some kind of game to her. Maybe you should go back to wherever it is you came from. Michael felt the rage boiling over, every insult, every slight building up inside him, but he forced himself to breathe, to hold back. He knew that no matter what he said, no matter how calmly he defended himself, people like her would always see him as the villain. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. Just as he was about to leave, the shrill sound of her SUV's engine revving caught his attention. Karen smirked, watching his reaction, and before he could fully register what was happening, she pulled her SUV forward, slamming it into the back of his car with a sickening crunch of metal on metal. A stunned silence fell over the parking lot. Michael could hardly believe what he was seeing, the damage she'd inflicted so blatant, so intentional, as if she were daring him to respond. His car was visibly dented, the back bumper hanging loose, the impact enough to make his chest tighten with anger and disbelief. Karen stepped out of her SUV, feigning surprise, her expression a mask of mock concern. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said with exaggerated innocence. "Looks like you parked too close. Maybe if you hadn't been so inconsiderate." Michael took a steadying breath, feeling the tension in his muscles, the rage building as he clenched his fists. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him react. He wouldn't let her provoke him into doing something he'd regret. As he stood there, helpless against her cruelty, the sound of police sirens broke the silence, filling the air with a note of unexpected relief. He felt a surge of hope as the patrol car pulled into the lot, two officers stepping out, their eyes moving between him and Karen, assessing the scene. Karen's expression shifted, a look of unease flashing across her face. She quickly put on an innocent, wounded expression, her hands clasped in front of her as she turned to the officers. "Thank goodness you're here," she cried, her voice trembling with feigned fear. "This man attacked me and then damaged my car." Michael felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, knowing how easily her words could sway the situation. But this time, he had witnesses, and the truth was written in the scratches along his car, the dented bumper, the evidence of her aggression there for all to see. He took a deep breath, ready to tell his side of the story, determined to hold on to the truth no matter how much she tried to twist it. As the officers approached, Michael felt a wave of relief tempered with a gnawing worry. He knew too well how situations like this could go wrong, how quickly a story could twist. But he steeled himself, determined to tell his side with calm clarity. This time, he'd ensure the truth was heard. One of the officers, a tall, serious-looking man with a calm demeanor, glanced between Michael and Karen, who was now putting on an impressive display of victimhood. She wiped an imaginary tear, her voice a theatrical tremble as she addressed the officers. "I was just trying to park," she whimpered, glancing over at Michael with a look of exaggerated fear. "And this man, he started yelling at me, and then he hit me." Her hand flew to her cheek, as if recalling the slap, though conveniently ignoring that she had struck first. "He even vandalized my car and tried to intimidate me. I was so scared." Michael clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to counter her theatrics with his own anger. He kept his hands visible, his posture calm, and spoke only when one of the officers turned to him. "Sir, would you mind explaining your side of the story?" Michael nodded, his voice steady. "I came here to get groceries, just like everyone else. I accidentally parked in a spot she wanted, and she approached me, very upset." He paused, measuring his words carefully, knowing each one mattered. "I tried to de-escalate, even offered to move. But she continued to harass me, made several derogatory remarks, and when I tried to walk away, she struck me." The officer raised an eyebrow, listening intently. "So, you're saying she hit you first?" "Yes," Michael replied firmly. "She slapped me, unprovoked. And I reacted, I did slap her back. But I only did so after she assaulted me. Karen let out a sharp, indignant gasp, putting on her most wounded look. Lies, she spat, her voice rising again, as if volume alone would make her more believable. He's twisting everything. He's been nothing but aggressive and hostile since I got here. The officers exchanged a glance, their skepticism evident. It was clear they'd encountered their fair share of, he said, she said, situations, and they seemed cautious, unwilling to jump to conclusions. The second officer, a shorter woman with a no-nonsense expression, took a step forward. "Ma'am," she said to Karen, "we're going to review the security footage. This grocery store has cameras that cover the parking lot." Karen's eyes widened, the mask of victimhood slipping momentarily as she registered the implication. For a brief second, her confident facade cracked, replaced by a flash of fear. "See cameras?" she stammered, trying to recover. "Well, I mean, that's fine, I'm sure they'll see how aggressive he was." Michael felt a flicker of relief. The security footage could finally reveal the truth, proving that he wasn't the aggressor here. The officers motioned for both him and Karen to wait by their vehicles as they headed inside to review the footage. Minutes ticked by, each second dragging with a weight that felt almost unbearable. Karen shot him occasional glares, her face twisted in anger as she muttered under her breath, barely audible insults that Michael ignored. He kept his focus steady, knowing that soon, the evidence would speak for itself. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned. Their expressions were unreadable, but Michael could sense a shift in the air. The female officer turned to him, her gaze softening slightly. "Mr. Jennings, we saw the footage. It corroborates your version of events." Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to find words. That's impossible," she spluttered, her voice rising in pitch. "He was harassing me. That video doesn't tell the whole story." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unimpressed by her outburst. "Ma'am," the male officer said, his tone firm, "the video shows you approaching Mr. Jennings first, verbally harassing him, and initiating physical contact by slapping him. He only responded after you struck him." Karen's composure unraveled completely. Her face contorted with a mix of disbelief and outrage, her voice shrill. "You're taking his side? He's lying. I didn't mean, it was just a bad day, all right? I didn't mean to do any of this." The officers remained impassive. "Ma'am, you also intentionally damaged his vehicle. We saw you scratching it with a key and ramming it with your SUV. Those are criminal offenses. I'm afraid we'll have to take you in for assault and property damage." Karen's face twisted, her initial shock morphing into fury as reality set in. "This isn't fair," she screamed, her voice loud and grating as she tried to wrestle her way out of the consequences. "I don't deserve this. He provoked me." But her words fell on deaf ears. The officers, accustomed to these scenes, calmly placed her in handcuffs, reading her rights as she continued to protest, her indignation filling the air with a bitter, desperate fury. They guided her toward their patrol car, her shouts fading as she was led away, the final act of her performance reaching its end. Michael watched, a strange mix of emotions swirling within him, relief, weariness, a lingering frustration. He'd won this battle, but he knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this. Situations like these, the prejudice and anger they ignited, had been part of his life for as long as he could remember. But today, at least, he'd stood his ground. The officers returned, the female officer giving him a small nod. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Jennings. We'll make sure she's held accountable for the damage to your car and her assault." Michael nodded, appreciating her professionalism. "Thank you. It's been a rough day." She offered him a sympathetic smile. "I understand. And we're glad you kept calm through all of this. If you need any assistance with the report or have questions about the legal process, feel free to reach out." He thanked her again and watched as they drove away, Karen's figure fading in the back seat of the patrol car. The tension that had been building in his shoulders finally began to ease, replaced by a sense of exhaustion. Later that evening, after he'd filed the necessary reports and made arrangements to repair his car, Michael sat down to reflect on everything that had happened. The events of the day weighed on him heavily, a reminder of the constant, unspoken struggle he faced in a world that didn't always see him for who he was but rather for the assumptions and biases that others projected onto him. He thought back to the words his lawyer, Miss Hayes, had once told him during another trying time. "Sometimes, standing up for yourself doesn't mean you'll change everyone's mind. But it shows that you won't let them define who you are." Today, he'd done just that. He hadn't allowed Karen to dictate his reality, hadn't given in to the story she tried to spin. The victory was small, perhaps, but it was his. He could face tomorrow knowing that, despite the prejudice and hostility he encountered, he had remained true to himself. As he closed his eyes, he felt a renewed resolve settle within him. The fight against injustice was never ending, but he knew he had the strength to face it, one day at a time.